I always have to remind myself how to pull up everything I need before beginning. Okay, now I think we're good. All right, so we'll get started. So my name is August Jackson, and there are a lot of familiar faces in here, and a lot of you know me, so I'll keep this brief. But I'm the interpretation coordinator at Mount Pisgah Arboretum, and part of my role there is putting on programs, walks, and workshops. And of course, those have had to be canceled. So we've run a few virtual programs, and I wanted to do this one, which is based on a walk I've done a few times over the last few years. And it's just kind of exploring the wildflower community that is still persisting as we move into summer, and particularly what's blooming still as we reach the longest day of the year. So the summer solstice is going to be tomorrow. And we have quite a few wildflowers that are adapted to the drought conditions that we normally experience in the Willamette Valley, really kind of starting around, the 1st of June. That's usually when we make a pretty big transition, see a big decline in precipitation. Of course, this year it's been a little different. I haven't looked, but I imagine it's one of the wettest Junes we've had in recent years. So things are a little delayed, but what's interesting is we also had some early blooms of some of these species starting in late May when it was quite a bit warmer. So some of these species are actually on their way out right now, whereas others that we'd usually see kind of at peak bloom are just starting or about to start. But everything that I'll be talking about today is in bloom right now. Even if on one or two of them, it's really just like the last few flowers hanging on, but I still wanted to highlight them because they're pretty neat. So we'll just go ahead and jump right in right now. And this is a gray hair streak visiting Tritelela hyacinthina, which is one of the flowers that's really abundant at the Arboretum right now. So let's see. The first thing we're going to talk about, just really briefly, because I know I don't want to bore you to tears, but it's just plant taxonomy. And the reason I want to talk about that is because a lot of the plant names of the plants that we're going to be looking at today have changed in recent years. And there's some reasons behind that rather than just being frustrating. So we'll quickly take a look at how plant taxonomy works and what it really means and why it matters. So there are newer molecular and chemical methods for establishing plant relationships. So in the past, you'd be relying pretty much entirely on morphological methods of comparison between plants and some chemical comparisons. But in more recent years, really since the 1990s, you can rely a lot more on DNA barcoding to determine relationships between plants. And because of that, we've seen a lot of name changes in the scientific names of plants as relationships between plants have been revised. So taxonomy is really trying to establish fundamental truths about relationships between plants through evolutionary history. And so I think paying attention to it for that reason is really neat. Now, you don't have to pay attention to it all the time, and you don't have to know all the scientific names of the plants. But I think in the context of this presentation, talking about this, I think it kind of adds to the understanding of relationships between plants. So in a few instances, we'll be talking about that and looking at it a little bit more. The other thing to note is that there are many more name changes still to come. So a lot of these name changes come out of the APG, which is the Angiosperm Phylogeny group, which is really just a group of plant taxonomists that kind of looks at all the work that's been done in plant taxonomy over the preceding few years between when they meet, takes a look at the papers that have been published and kind of determines which ones have merit and revises the sort of consensus taxonomy of plants. So they meet every few years or so. So a lot of these name changes are coming out of that. However, there is not fully consensus with any of this yet, and you can see that actually looking at this phylogenetic tree here. So this is an example of the order Asparagales, which includes the asparagus family, and there have been some really massive changes in this group. So if we look at it, you can see that kind of at the base of it is the Orchidaceae, which is the orchid family. And then all the way down at the bottom, you get the asparagus family. And in between, there are numerous other families. So this is actually a really large order that contains a ton of our plants. So you have the irises, and then you have the Amaryllidaceae, which includes the onions now. But if you go down, and I'll draw on the screen here really quickly, right here, there's the Thymadaceae. And that's a really interesting group that we're going to look at first. That has now been included in the family Asparagaceae. So it no longer exists. But if you look down at the bottom of that grouping, there's a star. And then if we look at what that star means, it means that branch has only 50 to 70% support. So it's only slightly more likely that it actually is a part of the asparagus family than not. So not all taxonomists have accepted this yet. And the Jepson manual, which is the manual to the higher plants of California, has not accepted this as part of the asparagus family yet. But we'll take a close look at some of these species because we actually have 3 of them or 4 of them in bloom right now. Marcia, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so I see that little star on the Ephilophanthiaceae line.
Yes.
It's not on the Thermidaceae line.
That's that star refers to that entire branch. So everything off of that branch.
Oh, okay.
Only has that level of support.
I was already finished with school when they brought these.
Oh, and it's and to be honest, all of the DNA barcoding stuff is substantially over my head. I just think looking at these relationships is neat and kind of helps to appreciate these plants a little more.
Okay, so
we won't be talking about this too much.
All right, let me ask one more question about it. Then. All these names here, the AC that are with on the right hand side, there's the code for or a bar for Asparagaceae. So all these families are gone. Is that right? So
everything. You can see there's a bar over on the far side that says asparagus SL or Asparagaceae SL. Yeah, so that's the new Asparagaceae family. So all of the family names within that bar are now gone. That's the idea.
Okay, including the Agavaceae and the Agavoideae.
Yep, that's the idea.
Wow.
Now, that doesn't have, as you can see, full support yet. So that still may change. And of course, there are a lot of name changes still to come when we're talking about just at the genus and species level. That's actually a lot harder to figure out in some ways because species concepts are a lot more flexible. So a lot of name changes still to come. So things you learned 30 years ago, some of that's disappearing, and things you're learning today, some of that's going to disappear. So that can be kind of frustrating, but the reason behind it is really just looking to establish more truths about how these plants are related, which I think is pretty neat. So I will clear all the drawings so I can move on to the next slide now. Okay, so we'll take a quick look at the former Thymadaceae. So this group is interesting because it includes Brodiaeas and former Brodiaeas. So we have a couple plants that used to be in that genus that have now been moved out based on further study, but they're all actually really, really closely related. So we have a group here that are really closely genetically related. And we'll just take a quick look at them. And in the past, these have been included in along with the onions and also along with the lilies. So they've gone all over the place and maybe finally settling down. This one is really common at the Arboretum right now. It's probably, a week or two from disappearing. Usually kind of spans the whole month of June, the bloom time. So this is Tritelela hyacinthina. It's known by the common names white Brodiaea. It used to be a Brodiaea. Hyacinth Brodiaea and Hyacinth Tritelela. We have a few different species in the genus Tritelela, but this one's super easy to recognize because it's the only one with these really bowl-shaped flowers. The others have fairly long corolla tubes, so they're actually kind of on tubes. These are bowl-shaped, fairly flat. The tepals have blue-green midveins, and just to clarify what a tepal is, it's basically you have tepals on plants when the petals and the sepals look the same and serve the same function. So you see that in the onions often and in the lilies often. So since they look the same and serve the same function, they get a different name, tepals, that basically suggests that they're petals and sepals together. So they have blue-green midveins, and then the stamen filaments, and you can see that in this circular inset, are somewhat triangular. So they're inflated, they're almost like a petal. So they're petaloid and somewhat triangular. So that's a really easy way to identify them and separate them from all the other Tritelela and pretty much anything else that you're going to see specifically at the Arboretum or in the greater Howard Buford Recreation Area. And this is the only member of its genus in the Howard Buford Recreation Area. So this grows pretty much throughout in open woodlands and savanna. And I should note that all of these Asparagaceae that we're looking at right now are edible. Their corms are edible and were eaten by indigenous peoples throughout their range. So these span up and down the west coast of North America. So pretty much wherever they grew, they were harvested and eaten by indigenous peoples. And in our area, that would primarily be the Kalapuya. On to the next one. This is Dichelostemma congestum. So this also used to be a Brodiaea. It's known by the name ukau or fork-tooth ukau. These are, usually pretty deep purple plants. This photo here is of one that's a little bit washed out in color, but they can range from this lighter purple to a deeper purple. They're fairly readily identifiable by these appendages here that you can see that are fork-toothed, and in the inset I have a really close-up picture of that fork-toothed appendage. So these are appendages that come from the base of the petals. So they're actually just kind of an inflated part at the base of the petal. And we see a lot of these really interesting modifications to some of the structures, whether it be petals, the stamens, in this group, and we'll see really interesting modification in the next set of plants. In this species, those appendages lean away from the three stamens in the middle. In the other species that we have in the Willamette Valley, which is Dichelostemma capitatum, the appendages lean in over the stamens. That species hasn't been recorded at the Arboretum or in the Howard Buford Recreation Area, but it is elsewhere throughout the Willamette Valley and could possibly be in the Howard Buford Recreation Area. The other way to really easily separate the two is that Dichelostemma capitatum, which goes by the common name blue dix, is it has 6 stamens. So 3 versus 6 stamens. So if you get a pretty close look at it, really easy to separate. But these are really, really beautiful. All the plants in this group that we're looking at right now are really well adapted to drought. Part of that is that they have a corm that's deep underground, so it resists drying out in the summer heat. And these actually kind of need to be fairly dry. So if you water an area that has these planted in it, you might kill them off. So they like to dry out a bit. They also all lose their leaves before blooming. So that helps with reducing water loss through transpiration. So by reducing the surface area, they lose less water. So by the time they're flowering, all the leaves are gone, and they're just on scapes, which is part of why they've been put into the onion family before, because they really have that similar morphology to onions. So now we'll go on to the next group of 2 species, and these are some of my favorites. I just find them to be really stunningly beautiful. So this is elegant Brodiaea, also known as harvest Brodiaea, and this is Brodiaea elegans subspecies hooveri, which is the subspecies that we have here in the southern Willamette Valley. These are generally rosy purple flowers with 6 tepals, like the other ones we've been looking at. But they have some really interesting modifications known as staminodes. And in the inset, you can see a close-up of the staminodes, and those are those white things that are outside the stamens. Now, staminodes are modified stamens. So these used to be, back in evolutionary history, these used to be fertile stamens, but they lost their pollen-producing capacity, and they became appendages to facilitate something. It seems like that something would probably have to do with pollination, but I haven't seen anything that's looking at that closely. So what they might do possibly is restrict access to the nectar and pollen rewards to a certain group of insects that can fit in between the staminodes and the stamens. So by doing so, perhaps they're restricting access to the most effective pollinators. That's one possibility. We do have one other species in the Willamette Valley and in the Howard Buford Recreation Area, and I just recently found a really large population of it. They're not common down here in the southern Willamette Valley, and that is Brodiaea coronaria, or crown Brodiaea. It's also known as harvest Brodiaea sometimes, so that's why common names are sometimes confusing. And we'll take a look at the difference between these two. But in this species, the staminodes are usually shorter than the stamens, so they're usually not as tall if you're looking at them kind of, at a 90-degree plane. And they're not enrolled along their margins, so their margins are fairly flat, and they're usually standing well away from the stamens. I say usually because there's actually an incredible amount of variability in these species, and particularly in the Eugene area. These have given taxonomists some problems, because one of the key features for Brodiaea elegans is supposed to be the staminodes being shorter than the stamens, but you'll find a number of individuals where they're not, they're longer. So when a taxonomist came to look at our populations for the flora of North America several years ago, he found ours to be somewhat troubling, but they kind of just write ours out of the keys, out of the descriptions, because they are just a little bit different, but still should be the same species. So you'll see these in open woodlands, savanna, and dry upland prairies, really dry sites. Right now you can find it kind of on the upper plateau of the Arboretum, and all along Trail 1 up to the summit. So just kind of trail side. They like really fairly rocky areas with poor soils. I think that allows them particularly to compete against some of the non-native pasture grasses that are so common in our area right now. Whoops, didn't mean to go there quite yet. Trying to pull up chat function, make sure. Are there any questions? For some reason I lost, there it is, there's the chat. Okay, now we're good. All right, so I'll go on to the next one now. So this is the crown Brodiaea, or Brodiaea coronaria. And if you take a close look at the staminodes, you can see they're quite different. They are enclosing the stamens, and they're taller than the stamens. Otherwise, these really look just about the same. You'll find them growing in more or less the same habitat and blooming at the same time of year. So pretty subtle differences, but this is a good example of kind of good Brodiaea coronaria that you can pretty easily separate out from the elegant Brodiaea. You can see the margins of the staminodes are also enrolled, so it really looks like they're kind of enveloping the stamens. Again, these are blooming right now. There's a very large population of them on this little coyote trail that's above the Arboretum's upper plateau. So it's sort of this unofficial cow-coyote trail that's existed for, well, probably since it was a ranch, and people still walk on it quite often. So it kind of goes along the arboretum boundary and then eventually out of the arboretum and hits up with a South Power Line Road. So that's a really nice place to see these right now. Of course, it's not a very good quality trail, but if you're interested in taking a look at these and kind of comparing the two, that's the spot to go. So all of these are in the asparagus family, and that kind of rounds up our trip of what's blooming in the asparagus family right now. And every single one of these that we just looked at was considered Brodiaea until fairly recently. So in that genus, they're all very closely related. And now we'll go on to, we're still in the same order, the asparagales, but we'll go to the Amaryllidaceae, which includes the onions. So this is our common onion right now. This is the slim leaf onion. And again, the leaves are gone by the time of bloom. So the slim leaf, doesn't really matter. You're probably not noticing them when they're vegetative. Their leaves and scapes are cylindrical, kind of like your chives in your garden, which separates them from just about, all the other onions that we might have in the Willamette Valley. We do have one other species, and I'm showing that here. That's Allium acuminatum, and that grows the Howard Buford Recreation Area. Rebecca, are you raising your hand?
I am.
Okay,
yes,
go ahead.
I couldn't ask my question fast enough, but on your last slide,
yeah,
there was a bug on the blue petal.
Yeah.
What is that blue bug? Because they're in my yard.
That's just a little springtail, so a tiny little thing.
A tiny, thank you. That's all I needed to know.
So there, I can zoom in a little bit. You can kind of see it a little better.
A little springtail. Okay, thank you.
Oops. So with this species, you have these white to lightly pink tepals, 6 stamens. They're pretty easy to identify. You see an onion and it looks at all like this, it's gonna be this. If you grow these in the garden, they're pretty great. They spread abundantly, both by seed and by corms underground. So eventually you'll have quite a few. And they're really tasty too. So you can eat the scapes, you can eat the bulbs, but the scapes are a lot like chives. So once you get a lot of them in your garden, you can just start, using them a little bit in salads and things like that. This is a really neat species. It is on its way out right now, so just a few blooms left. And this grows, where I've found it growing is between the upper and lower entrance roads to the Arboretum. So the lower road is the one that we open to facilitate festival traffic. So there's kind of a wet prairie that's between those roads. And this grows here. It's a really rare Willamette Valley endemic. And this was recognized as a separate species, kind of confirmed as a separate species about 5 to 6 years ago. So one of the former Arboretum employees, Matt Groberg, while he was at Oregon State University, did his master's thesis on this species and confirmed it as a separate species, both through analyzing its morphology and analyzing the DNA. So this only grows in the Willamette Valley and a little bit south into Douglas County around the Roseburg area. And it can be separated from all other blue-eyed grasses by the characteristics written on the side. And one of the easiest ways is just that the yellow eye at the base of the flower is pretty much lacking in this species, whereas in the others, it's quite large. So it actually looks like a real strong yellow eye at the base of the flower. That's kind of a quick and easy way to recognize these. It's not always that simple because there is quite a bit of variation, but when you see one like in these photos where the yellow eye is just about absent or not there, it's this species. So it seems to tend to grow in vernally wet areas. That's where I found it. Sarah's asking, is this different from Western blue-eyed grass? Yes. So there are a couple blue-eyed grass species that we have in the Willamette Valley. There's this one, then there's Western, or it's also called Idaho blue-eyed grass. That's Sisyrinchium idahoense. And then there's Sisyrinchium bellum, and I don't remember what the common name for that is. And there's some, you know, they're not always very easy to separate unless you have really good examples of each species, because there's a lot of variation among individuals. But they all look to be very distinct species when you look at their DNA. They have very different chromosome numbers, so they cannot cross-pollinate. They can't form hybrids.
So,
Yeah, Rebecca?
so I have the Idahoense growing in my yard because I
Sure.
got the start at the native plant sale.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and they are growing some of this species, but I don't know if they're offering it for sale yet or not. I can't remember. All right, so now we're moving into a totally different group. So we're into the aster family. This is one that's fairly abundant right now. These are the narrowleaf mule-ears. These are really beautiful, big sunflower-like flowers. They get up to, you know, about 2 feet tall. You can see these really abundantly along the lower parts of Trail 3 from the east parking lot, and also along Trail 1 up to the summit right now. And then a few years ago, I discovered a fairly healthy patch in the Arboretum between the upper and lower roads, again, where the right alongside that Hitchcock's blue-eyed grass that we just looked at. And this population is luckily expanding. So it's gone from 3 flowering plants a couple years ago to, I counted 6 this year. So it looks to be doing pretty well. And that's nice because it's a really nice species and a really attractive species too. Again, these get up to about 2 feet tall, really big flowers. They look a lot like our balsam roots. So a balsam root is another, you know, kind of clumpy sunflower like this. We have a number of balsam root species throughout Oregon. The easiest way to separate these is that they have colline leaves, whereas balsam roots don't. And a colline leaf just means it's a leaf on the flower stem. So on the balsam roots, the flower stem is going to be bare. On the Wyethias, it's going to have stems on the leaf, or leaves on the stems. So you'll see these growing both in upland prairie and in wet prairie. For whatever reason, the best populations at Mount Pisgah seem to be kind of in the wet prairie. And then sticking in the aster family still, this is elegant tarweed, Madia elegans. These are kind of mid-sized sunflower-like flowers. You know, only going to be about that big at their biggest. They have long, thin rays, and some flowers have dark kind of maroon red at the base of those ray flowers, particularly in, I see that more in Southern Oregon, Northern California. So there may be some geographic variation there. They're lightly aromatic, especially when compared to some of the other tarweeds, which are really, really strongly aromatic. And they tend to have their flowers on multi-branched, hairy, and glandular stems. And we'll take a close look at these glandular stems in a minute. These tend to exist and do best in upland prairie with thin and poor soils. So a place you can see a really massive population of them right now is about halfway up Trail 1 to the summit. Once you go up the steepest part of the trail and turn to the south, up on the side of the trail there's a really dense population of these with 1,000 to 2,000 plants in bloom right now. So really beautiful. And if you can get up there to take a look at it, I encourage doing so. These also do pretty well in the garden. I have several of these in the garden right now, and they reseed readily. They're a great pollinator plant. These are also really culturally important to indigenous peoples, again, throughout their range. So up and down the West Coast, and with the tarweed that we're going to look at next, all the way down into South America. And primarily what was used was the seeds. So the seeds are more or less like sunflower seeds. And so these were really highly prized, both for producing flowers from the seeds, as in a ground flower, and producing oils. So these were maintained through the use of fire. This is a plant that is an annual and gets crowded out really easily. And now that we really have kind of a lack of fire in the Willamette Valley, the reason we tend to see these more in pretty poor sites is those are the only places that they can compete with the existing vegetation. Whereas we would have seen these a lot more widespread in the past. So this is the other tarweed that we have right now. This is known as Chilean tarweed or coast tarweed. And Chilean tarweed, because it grows all the way down through South America into Chile, where it was cultivated. So the name sativa means to be sown. So this was a Madia that was in cultivation in parts of its range. It has much smaller flowers than the elegant tarweed, shorter, wider ray flowers. It's very, very strongly aromatic. So the flowers don't have that much of a smell, but the glandular trichomes on the stems and leaves, which we'll take a look at, produce a really intense smell that is kind of like tar. And a lot of people don't like the smell. A lot of people do like the smell. I personally think it's a nice smell. But you can sometimes really smell it in the air after rain, if you have a large number of these in a certain area. So let's take a look at these glandular stems really quickly and talk about what they do for the plant, because it's really fascinating. So this photo shows, you can see the glands. So those are the trichomes. And you can also see in this a ton of insects that are trapped and dead. So these trichomes do a few things for the plant, and there's a really interesting study on this. One thing they do is they trap plant sap-sucking insects and kill them. They don't actively kill them, but they're trapped there and they basically just die. So that helps the plant in the sense that these insects are not able to suck the sap from it. But it also helps the plant by bringing in predatory insects. So larger predatory insects like assassin bugs sometimes feed on carrion, so they'll be attracted to plants like this. They don't get stuck because they're a lot larger, so these sticky trichomes don't really affect them. So they'll feed on the carrion, and then they'll hang out on the plant and deal with more sap-sucking insects and caterpillars, some of the bigger ones that might not get trapped by the trichomes. So studies have found that the individuals of these with more trichomes have more carnivorous insects hanging out on them and essentially protecting them. So there's a term for this that's used sometimes known as proto-carnivory, which I think is kind of a neat term. Some botanists have a problem with the term because it sort of suggests an endpoint, that these are progressing evolutionarily towards carnivory, whereas maybe this is actually all they'll ever go, which is just this sort of proto-carnivory where they're just trapping insects and relying on other things to come in and eat them. So, in drought conditions, it makes sense to be particularly wary of plant-sucking insects, anything that's going to take any water from you. And this is a species that blooms from about now, often through August, sometimes into September, especially if we get a little more rain. So really through the driest months of the year in what are pretty extreme drought conditions. But that's not the only purpose these trichomes serve. And the other one is just as cool and weird. The other thing they do is any evapotranspiration that occurs from the plant stems and leaves is trapped and sort of condensed by these trichomes. So these trichomes help the plant almost create a insulative atmosphere around the stems and leaves. So as the water's evaporating, it gets trapped a bit. And so you almost get sort of a cloud forming around the plant. Now, of course, it's not visible, but you have this region of higher humidity surrounding the stems and leaves, and thus reducing the capacity for further transpiration. So that's another way that these trichomes help the plant save water during summer drought, which I find to be pretty fascinating. So here we have another pretty common sunflower type plant. This is Oregon sunshine, or woolly sunflower. These really take on a lot of different forms in terms of their leaves, but all of their leaves are woolly, at least on the underside. And we have intergrading forms throughout Oregon. So I think some of the forms of this plant that have been recognized in the past are kind of being recognized more as just intergrades between forms. All of it's the same species, so it doesn't really matter. These grow really well in upland prairie and in open oak woodlands, and they attract a lot of different insects. And we have another one that's really common right now. This is Philadelphia fleabane. This grows in disturbed areas, in meadows. This is kind of the one plant that can compete really well with the non-native pasture grasses that are so common in a lot of our oak savannas and oak woodlands. They're pretty distinctive. They have numerous ray flowers, really long, thin, pinkish white ray flowers, more than 150 per composite flower. And then they have the bright yellow disc flowers. Tall stems, and then the stem leaves are clasping around the stem, which you can see in inset photo. And then we have common yarrow, which is another really well-known plant. Pretty hard to mistake for anything else, to be honest. The one thing that I do see people mistaking this for is just plants in the carrot family. So these actually just from afar look more like plants in the carrot family than others in the aster family. They kind of remind people of Queen Anne's lace often, or they look like cow parsnip too a little bit. Of course, a much shorter cow parsnip. So the ray flowers are 3 to 5 per flower. And let's take a closer look at the flowers, because up close I think they're really beautiful. So here's a close look. So they have the disc flowers in the middle, and then 3 to 5 ray flowers. So when we look at them from far away, they're not that spectacular looking, but up close I think they look really neat. Here we have our native heal-all or self-heal. So this is Prunella vulgaris, variation lanceolata. So the variation is native. We also have variation vulgaris, which is non-native, and that's the one that's a really common yardweed. The flowers look basically the same, except they're smaller and usually not held on erect stems. So the stems of this species can get to 12 to 18 inches tall. So quite different than the lawn weed that we have. But the really good way to separate them is based on the leaf shape. So in variation lanceolata, the leaf shapes are lanceolate, so quite a bit longer and spear-shaped than they are in the non-native variety. You can see this is in the mint family, really interesting, really attractive flowers. You can see the fringed lower petal lips. So these are really common, particularly in wet prairies. Again, they grow in both wet and dry prairie, but seem to be really common in wet prairies. And then we have one more mint family member that we'll take a look at right now. This is Yerba Buena. It's in the genus Clinopodium. It's Clinopodium douglasii. Used to be in a different genus, Saturasia, and it's going to change the genus again, but we don't know where yet, but it will change again because it's not currently placed correctly. This is a pretty easy to identify plant. It grows in coniferous forests and forest edges. It's pretty common right now along the Incense Cedar Trail in the Arboretum. It has these really small, basically mint-like flowers. and really, really highly aromatic leaves. So if you find something that looks like this, you pick off a leaf and crush it. Really strongly aromatic. This is a really prized medicinal herb. Was introduced to to Spanish missionaries in California by the native people, and the Spanish missionaries gave it the name Yerba Buena. And interestingly enough, the town that would become San Francisco was eventually or originally named Yerba Buena by the Spanish missionaries. So this is a pretty neat plant that kind of stretches up and down the West Coast. Oh, it looks like, did I miss something in the chat? Let me pop that up quickly. Marcia, I think I missed your question.
So will this be in the same Lamiaceae still, or is it going to move?
Yes. Yes, this will still be a mint. It's just in the wrong genus.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, now we're jumping families again. So now we're into the rose family, the Rosaceae. This is one of my favorite plants. I think they're stunningly beautiful, and I think it has one of the best common names of our plants, ocean spray. Because when you see one of these up close, particularly with the pendulous flowers, it really looks like crashing wave, a spray coming off of a crashing wave. So these are really, really beautiful plants. Lots of small white flowers in diffuse drooping panicles. These grow sometimes on cliff faces alongside rivers. You tend to see them in more riparian areas, but sometimes in the dry parts of the riparian areas, like cliff faces. They also do pretty well in the home garden. Part of the reason they're one of my favorite plants is because they attract an extraordinary amount of insects. So this is kind of a cornucopia plant. So, you know, pretty much in every season you get a couple plants that really attract a large proportion of the pollinating fauna. And for right now, this is one of them. So it brings in a lot of really interesting bees, flies, wasps, and butterflies. And it brings in some bees that we don't see very often. We'll take a quick look at those. This is Hyriades carinata. This is a native solitary bee related to the mason bees. It nests in cavities in wood. It's a very small bee, and it's particularly interesting because it's not commonly found in the Willamette Valley, but I find it at Mount Pisgah on ocean spray, and it uses plant resins to seal its nest cells. So I have these in my yard, and they seal their nest cells with Douglas fir sap, which they collect and then carry back to the nest. Another one that's not common in the area, but commonly on ocean spray is this Coletes concadii. This is known as a polyester bee. These are pretty neat just by the fact that they nest in the ground and line their nest cells with a polyester-like substance that they secrete that is waterproof. So they waterproof their cells with what is, you know, really actually a true polyester. And then still in the rose family, these got off to an early bloom this year in mid-May. And they often kind of start blooming around that time, but they tend to persist well into June, sometimes, you know, through July 4th. This is Nootka rose, Rosa nootcana. Pretty common, especially along creek sides, riversides, wetland areas, and it actually grows in wet prairies too. In certain areas, they have to treat this kind of like a weed at Finley National Wildlife Refuge. It encroaches readily and pretty intensively into wet prairie areas that in the past would have burned regularly once every, you know, 1 to 5 years, but now burn a lot less frequently. So it allows for the growth of shrubs like this. But where they, you know, grow naturally along creeks and stream sides, they grow in pretty dense thickets. There's a really nice thicket along the creek trail and the arboretum that you can walk through and just be overwhelmed by the scent on some days when it's in full bloom. So they have a really, really nice fragrance. Pretty easy to separate from the other roses based on their sepals. So if you look at the inset photo, the sepals are longer than the petals, and they have kind of leafy tips that are inflated, almost spoon-like. And those sepals also persist after the flower is gone and the fruit is forming. So fairly easy to recognize by those sepals. And then this is also in the rose family. Looks quite different, of course, than a lot of the roses, but you know, if we remember that strawberries are in the rose family too, this is looking a lot more like a strawberry. So this is slender cinquefoil. It has these bright yellow flowers that are really kind of almost the same yellow as buttercups, but they're not shiny like buttercups are. You'll find these kind of scattered in woodlands and prairie throughout Mount Pisgah. It's a really good plant for restoration because it grows pretty readily and competes well with some of the non-native species. So this has been planted in some of the restoration projects across Mount Pisgah. The leaflets are really kind of coarsely toothed, and the leaves are palmate. So you can see the leaf here in the inset. These leaves are pretty characteristic. So you can identify this plant pretty readily, even when it's not in bloom. And then leaving the rose family, we're into the honeysuckle family now. This is the Caprifoliaceae. So right now we have two species in this family blooming. This one and snowberry, which I won't show, but snowberry is in the honeysuckle family. And that's also a very common plant in bloom right now. So this is Lonicera hispidula, known by the names hairy honeysuckle and pink honeysuckle. It has these pinkish, sometimes yellow tinged tubular flowers. The only other honeysuckle species that we have at the Arboretum and really in the Willamette Valley is Lonicera ciliosa, which is the orange honeysuckle, which has these bright orange, super long flowers. So they're really easy to identify and separate out. We do have some non-native honeysuckles, but they look a lot more, frankly, they look exotic. They look like ornamentals because they essentially are escaped ornamentals. So you usually won't confuse them. These really like to grow in woodlands and forest edges. You'll often see them kind of scrambling along the ground in certain areas, looking for something to climb on. They won't flower unless they're climbing up something. And once they start climbing, they really become a woody vine. So these are kind of scattered around. There's some really fantastic specimens of this in bloom right now. But you have to be looking for them because, again, it takes a while to get to the size and to find a tree that'll support them in the right way. But pretty spectacular. I want to point out really quickly, if we just grab this tool here. So right here, that is leafcutter bee activity. So we have leafcutter bees in the genus Megachile out right now that are cutting pretty characteristic segments out of leaves to take back to their nest as nesting material. And then this is just a photo of same plant, just a little larger, different perspective. You can see they have these pretty interesting perfoliate leaves below the flowers, and perfoliate just means that it's essentially, in a disc, and the stem is passing through it. It doesn't even look like separate leaves, and that's pretty characteristic of a lot of our honeysuckles. We'll go to the next one. Another really, really gorgeous plant. It's blooming, kind of scattered. You'll never find these in abundance anywhere you go, but it likes more or less riparian areas, sometimes coastal bluffs, cliff sides. You actually find it growing a lot in Eastern Oregon in places that it seems really dry, but it's getting moisture from a nearby creek. These are really finicky if you ever try to grow these in your yard. They're difficult. But where they take off, they become almost a small tree, up to about 10 feet tall. So these are in the hydrangea family, and we only have 2 species in Oregon that are in the hydrangea family. So not a very common family here. And the mock orange is one, and it's really distinctive. You're probably not going to confuse it with anything else. It has 4 petals and a really, really strong orange-like fragrance. So these flowers just smell incredible. And one plant that you can visit readily right now is on the edge of the wildflower garden at the Arboretum, going out along the river off to your left a little bit into the meadow. And it was planted there probably 15, 20 years ago. And it did take, and it is doing well. And it's in full bloom right now and really fragrant. And then finally, we're going to end off with just a really weird plant. This is in the Polemoniaceae, or the phlox family, and you can see the flowers are pretty phlox-like. These are really short and stubby, often 4 inches off the ground. So to appreciate them, it's one of those plants you kind of have to get on your belly to look at. It's known by the name needleleaf Navarretia intertexta. And the leaves are just super interesting because they're essentially needle-like. They're just really thinly divided, but also really thickened so that they are almost spine-like. This tends to grow in vernally wet areas and washes, so you'll see it in kind of vernal pools that form, the same places that you find plants like popcorn flowers and Downingia, but it also grows in ditches, other places that stay wet a little bit longer into the summer. So you can find these kind of scattered throughout Mount Pisgah, anywhere that looks like it's been muddy fairly recently. You might find these. So they're a really neat, often overlooked flower that I thought it would be just kind of a nice way to end things on, because you might not actually want to get on the ground to take a close look at one of these. And with that, I will kind of stop and just take questions. So feel free to jump in and unmute yourself to ask any questions.
Do we have the stinky Navarretia?
Oh, yes. Navarretia squarosa?
Yeah, that's
yes. I haven't seen it growing in the wild. I've only seen it growing actually at the Friends of Buford Park plant nursery, where it is extremely stinky.
very well. It grows in the wetlands.
Yeah.
But I think it appeared on its own. I think it showed up on its own there.
Yeah.
I mean the West Eugene wetlands.
Okay.
That's what I meant.
Yeah, it's a fairly common native species in the right habitat. Yeah, and it does really well in the nursery. If you want your neighbors to think you're growing marijuana, that's the plant. Rebecca.
I just want to say that's the best botany lesson I've ever had.
Well, thanks.
So I wanna just thank you for putting that together, because it helped me to understand the technical language better.
Sure.
Yeah. That's what I really love about it. I mean, I sort of knew what most of them were, but you increased my ID ability much better. Thank you.
Well, good. Sure. Yeah, I tried to not make it too technical.
Oh, that technical I could deal with. If there's more technical than that, then I start to, I get into information overload. But I was really grateful for. I'm glad I was here.
Well, thanks. It's good to see you.
This was good preparation for tomorrow's solstice. Thank you very much, August.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, it should be a beautiful one. Finally, an end to the rain.
I was able to go along my iNatural list, observation list, and find the plants you were talking about, and then compare my picture to yours, and then try to find the features you were talking about, because all of the language is new to me. I don't.
Yeah.
And I do go out with Gail Baker, and of course she uses all that language, and I've so far not stopped her to reveal my ignorance. So, you know, so she says, well, look at the stamens, and I'm going like, oh yeah, you know, and I really actually don't know what part of the plant that is. But I was able to figure some of that out. So I too really appreciate the practice on the language and the clarity of the photos. It was very, very helpful.
Great. Yeah, and these are some really, really neat plants out right now. And then of course, you know, we actually have another suite of plants that starts kind of around July. That includes some of the ones that are in even wetter areas. Douglas Brodiaea, for example. And then we have our fall plants. So there, you know, a lot of people think of Oregon wildflowers as being a spring thing, and they are. That's really when we have our peak bloom. But we have a lot that persists through the summer and into the fall.
Is there a current plant list, or is it all the plant lists before the name changes?
There is a semi-current plant list for the Arboretum, and that is available on our website. I think under we redid our website, so I can't remember precisely where it is. There is also a plant list for the entire hill, but it's not public yet. I know that there's an effort to make a public version of it. I think part of the reason it's not public yet is because it undergoes revisions pretty much every year. But there is an effort to make a public version.
So I also wanted to let people know that Summer Solstice in Stonehenge is being live streamed. If you want to find out how to get there, go to earthsky.org. And then they'll confuse you with the time zones. I can't tell what time it's going to be. I looked and looked for an hour this morning. I figured, but I'm going to start looking around noon tomorrow and see if they've started up the live stream. So that's just a guess.
Sounds like a decent guess.
No.
Wow. So, August.
Yeah.
Have you? Can you hear me, or am I?
I can. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So you recorded this.
Yes.
So this will now be archived. Have you recorded any similar talks for spring or fall?
No.
Is this the first one?
This is the first one other than the ones on fly pollination I did back in April.
Okay.
So those are on the website right now.
Cool.
And this will go up on the website too. And then as long as we keep doing these, we will we'll record them and have them available. You know, I'm hoping at some point we can go back to doing in-person events, and we may do some small in-person events again starting in August. But you know, I think for the near future, you know, we'll probably be doing some virtual programming.
Oh, this is very effective education.
Well, I'm glad. I mean, I think it has its merits. You know, in some ways I can show, you know, certain structures a little, you know, closer up.
You talk about them differently than you do in the field because we can't see it as well as, I mean, when you've got your picture there and, you know, like that whole thing about the plant with the sticky, you know, that catches the bugs, you know, you could show it so well.
Yeah, it's true. I think the one thing I don't like about it is just you lack some of the context of, you know, where the plants are growing and how they look when they're growing, and but you know, there are trade-offs.
Okay, yes, that is the beauty. I know, but I've been way more glued into, you know, what is that and what family it is, and and this was extremely helpful for that. Yep.
Good.
I like the 2 or 3 little clues you gave to this will pin it down, and this, if it has these three things, it's this flower.
Yes.
I like that collection. that you
Yes.
have.
Yeah. I was trying to help you identify things, at least compared to other things you might see in this area.
Yes, right.
Cool. All right.
Deb, you're muted. Deb, you're muted.
Nice to hear about the bees too. I hope you do more on those.
Yes. I'm giving a talk for Oregon Wild on what, next Wednesday about Oregon's bees. So if you're interested in that, that's on their website right now. Yeah, it's National Pollinator Week next week.
Oh. All right. Well, thank you. I'm going to go now.
All right, good to see you. Take care.
Okay, dear. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Nice.
Thank you,
Thanks,
thank you.
August. Thanks,
Bye.
everybody.
Yeah, thank you.
Good to see everybody. I'm out.